You're aware of the fact, maybe, that psychopaths exist amongst us, human predators that walks around and grabs people and use them and throw them out used and maybe stalk them afterwards. There are human predators amongst us.
Christian and his friend are eagerly scouting the horizon. It's only been 15 minutes since they left the harbor in the coastal suburb of Ishøy, and as their boat cuts through the calm water, they do their best to spot any sign of the missing submarine. The news had been bizarre. A quirky inventor named Peter Madsen, who had built his own submersible vessel, had been reported missing while taking a Swedish journalist on a trip under the sea. And while the Danish authorities were out in full force conducting a search and rescue operation, a number of civilian boats had immediately joined the search efforts. But suddenly Christian spots something. Jutting out of the waves, the silhouette of a small submarine appears before them. At first they wonder if it's one of the Swedish submersibles that have joined the search. But when they make out the designation UC3 on the conning tower, they know they've found what they're looking for. And as they get closer, they see the inventor himself stand atop the vessel. But Peter Madsen initially seems oddly calm, and before Christian and his friend are able to reach him, he suddenly disappears below deck. They also notice a strange mist hovering above the hull, almost as if the submarine is emitting some kind of heat, and then it starts to sink. Christian is flustered, but soon Peter Madsen reappears in the conning tower. The man waits for another boat to get even closer, and finally he jumps into the water and swims over to it. As his life fork, the submarine Nautilus, sinks beneath the waves behind him. The report had mentioned that there had been at least 2 people aboard the Nautilus, but Peter Madsen quickly tells his rescuers that he had been the only passenger. But Christian can't help shake the feeling that Peter is acting oddly calm considering the peril he had found himself in over the last few hours, while supposedly experiencing mechanical problems. And what else is strange is the fact that dozens of vessels had been searching for the submarine for hours, yet when Christian and his friend had left the harbor, it had only taken them 15 minutes to come across the damaged submersible. Christian stays near the spot where the Nautilus sank in order to point it out to the police when they arrive, and meanwhile the boat that Peter had swum to heads back to shore. The inventor and entrepreneur, who over the last decade had become a media personality in Denmark, was alive and well, and the search, which had lasted all night and morning, could finally be concluded. But there was still an overshadowing question that hadn't been answered. Where was the Swedish journalist that Peter Madsen had taken for a trip aboard the submarine? After all, it was her partner who had reported them missing in the middle of the night, when she had failed to return from the trip, which was only supposed to have taken a couple of hours. Today, I'm going to talk about one of the most strange Danish murder cases in recent times. This is the tragic story of Kim Wall, who was murdered and dismembered on August 10th, 2017, by a man who seemed to be a fascinating and passionate person on the surface, but in reality harbored a twisted and perverted quality deep in his soul. Unlike last week's episode, this is not the sort of story that will offer you a number of different theories. It's pretty clear what happened that summer night in 2017. That's perhaps also why this episode will not be as long as some of my other ones. But the story remains so bizarre that I still think it's worth telling, not least to explore the immense injustice that befell a young woman who had done nothing to deserve such a horrific fate.
Psychopathic people are often very charismatic. They are excellent speakers. They're convincing. They are having illusions of self-grandeur and have no regard for anyone else. And he will try really to punish those people who have been under his spell. He will try to punish them afterwards by stalking them, by talking badly about them, all these things. There is the possibility that you've simply come upon a human predator. And I wouldn't know. Because do the psychopaths know that he's a psychopath? I'm not sure.
If you haven't done so already, make sure to subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any future episodes. Let's get on with today's story. Peter Madsen is an unusual person. Most people that grow up wanting to be an inventor discover the realities of life by the time they finish school, and they find a quote-unquote real job instead. And even fewer end up actually able to support themselves by designing submarines and space rockets. But that's exactly what Peter did. Born on January 12, 1971, he spent his early life near the town of Kalundborg in Denmark. His mother, Annie, was 30 years younger than his father, Carl, and she had 3 other sons from previous relationships. Supposedly, Peter's father was abusive towards his half-brothers. So when Peter was 6 years old, his mother left her husband and took all of the children with her. But after a couple of years, Peter went back to living with his father. Apparently, they shared an early interest in rockets, and evidently they began to bond over this. While he attended primary and secondary school, Peter went on to develop an enthusiasm centered on specifically rocket fuel, which was urged on by his chemistry and physics teacher. And in 1986, when he was only 15 years old, he actually built his own small rocket. This rocket, which he had put together in his father's workshop, was launched in March of that year. And supposedly it reached a height of 330 feet before crashing to the ground without harming anyone. But importantly, this incident imbued a passion in him, which would later inspire his many projects, and he carried this mechanical interest with him when he was accepted to a secondary school in the city. Leaving his father's home behind, Peter moved into a shared living facility, and only a couple of years later, Carl Madsen would die when Peter was only 19 years old. Peter continued to do all kinds of experiments whenever he could, and he would often consult different engineers in order to plan his endeavors. At one point, he also befriended the family which was in charge of the fireworks display at the famous Tivoli Gardens in Copenhagen. Eventually, he also joined a group called the Dansk Amatør Raketklub, which roughly translates to Danish Amateur Rocket Club. But apparently the other members gradually grew disillusioned with him over time, and a former member would jokingly at one point comment that, and I quote, "simply mentioning Peter's name could have started the fire alarm." Peter never finished any formal education, but he did take courses in welding and engineering in order to learn different skills. Over the years, he managed to make a living through financial support from individuals, organizations, and companies, which saw the potential in the young and charismatic inventor. And honestly, after watching many interviews with him, it's not hard to imagine how his enthusiasm could have felt contagious. Peter was married in 2011 to a woman whose identity was not revealed in the media, but she evidently worked in the film industry and had also at one point helped out at his workshop in Copenhagen. But after the events in 2017, she left him when he was charged with the murder. Peter has later claimed that they had lived in an open relationship, and it's also been reported that he had been a regular at sex parties for some time. And obviously neither of those things are crimes, but after what happened later on, the media has been quick to point out any hints at sexual nonconformity that may have been evident from incidents earlier in Peter's life. Anything that may have been able to explain the twisted fantasies he would later act out. Before the murder of Kimball, Peter was already somewhat famous. Not famous in the way that anyone in the world would recognize Brad Pitt if he walked down the street. But because of his many ambitious projects, Peter would often feature prominently in the press. In 2008, Peter co-founded a company called Copenhagen Suborbitals with Danish architect Christian von Bengtsson, and he had specifically been responsible for designing the launch system, the launch pad, and the booster rocket engines. Their stated goal was to have one of its team members reach space on a suborbital spaceflight. Over time, however, disagreements between Peter and Christian von Bengtsson led to Peter leaving the project in 2014. But his involvement with the company had publicly earned him the nickname Raketmessen, which means Rocket Messen. His departure from Copenhagen Suborbitals, however, enabled Peter to devote his full time to his other passion, which was submersibles. Over the years, he had constructed 3 different submarines: the UC-1, also called Freya, the UC-2, also called Kraka, and finally the UC-3, which was called the Nautilus. But as we approached the fateful summer of 2017, the Nautilus was the only vessel still in operation. Peter had first launched it in May of 2008, and it had taken over 3 years and more than $200,000 to complete. Over the years, the Nautilus made hundreds of dives in the waters near Denmark, but in 2017, it made its last trip, when it sank to the bottom of the sea. It was salvaged by the cops the next day after Peter had been rescued by a civilian boat, but later on the entire submarine would be destroyed by the Danish authorities. Maybe it could have been repaired, but that wasn't the issue. The problem was that the Nautilus was not simply just a boat anymore. After it had served for years as an example of the resolve of a passionate man, it was now a horrific crime scene. Kim Wall had seen much of the world by the time she turned 30. She had studied at a number of noteworthy colleges, including the University in Lund in Sweden, the London School of Economics and Political Science, Beijing University, and Columbia University. But after graduating, she had pursued a career as a freelance journalist, a job which saw her work published by The Guardian, The New York Times, Harper's Magazine, and Vice. And when she wrote a report on nuclear tests and climate change in the Marshall Islands in 2016, she received an award for her coverage of the subject. All indications are she was a woman who thrived when challenging herself, constantly seeking her next adventure. But tragically, she had no idea that her fervor and passion would one day put her on a collision course with a twisted and dangerous person. And after traveling the world in a relentless search of impactful stories to tell, she would meet her end only a short way from her home in southern Sweden. On Thursday, August 10, 2017, Kim Wall and her partner Ole Stobbe are getting ready to host a going-away party. They are moving to Beijing on August 16. But before they leave, they want to throw a party at Refshaleøen in Copenhagen and see some of their friends one final time. But that day, Kim receives a text message. Earlier in the year, you see, she had requested an interview with Danish inventor and entrepreneur Peter Madsen, and seemingly out of nowhere, he has replied to her message offering to take her out on his homemade submersible that same evening. Even though they still plan on hosting the party, Kim and her partner know that she shouldn't turn this opportunity down. So Kim quickly texts Peter Madsen back and thanks him for the offer. After all, she can just join Ole and their friends later on. Kim and Peter agree to sail out for about 2 hours aboard the Nautilus, and after Peter picks her up around 7 p.m., the sub quickly disappears under the sea for what should have been an exciting trip for Kim to later tell their friends about at the party. But Kim Wall is never seen alive again. This ominous picture was taken from land as she and Peter stand aboard the submarine minutes prior to diving into the water. What exactly happened aboard the Nautilus is not entirely known, in part due to the conditions under which her body was later found. The only person who really knows would be Peter Madsen himself, and it's impossible to assert how truthful he has been about the incident. Ole, Kim's partner, calls the cops at 1:43 a.m. that night to report her missing. Kim has failed to join the party, and as the hours went by, it's easy to imagine that Ole would have grown more and more concerned about her. After all, she is taking a ride on a homemade submarine. Over the course of the night, both Danish and Swedish authorities embark upon a search operation. Eventually, the word is spread to civilian vessels as well, and many join in to find the submersible. It's assumed at this point that the boat has encountered mechanical problems and is possibly stranded on the seabed. The hope is that the problem is purely electrical, which is why the submarine has failed to declare an emergency. But the reality that will later be revealed is of course a lot more sinister. A civilian boat finally spots the Nautilus around 10:30 a.m. in the Køge Bay near the Drogden Lighthouse, southeast of the island of Amager. And I described in the beginning of the episode what happens next. Peter Madsen is rescued, but there is no sign of Kim Wall. By 11 a.m., the Nautilus sinks beneath the water, and Peter is taken ashore.
Jeg har det fint.
Nå, det er godt.
Lidt ked af det.
Er du ked af det?
Nå, det er jo klart.
Ja.
Og din Nautilus går ned var ekstremt. Men fint nok.
Har du helt roligt hele tiden?
Jamen, jeg var bare på en øvetur, hvor jeg legede med forskellige ting på ubåden, og så opstod der en fejl på en ballasttank.
Okay.
Som ikke var særlig alvorligt. Indtil jeg prøvede at reparere den, så blev den pludselig meget alvorlig.
Okay.
Så tog det cirka 30 sekunder for Nautilus at synke, og jeg kunne ikke lukke lurer eller noget. Så men det var måske også meget godt, så var jeg jo stadig glad dernede.
Ej, hvor er du med op i?
Det der håb, men det er sket for søværnet tilsvarende.
Ja.
det koster lige så meget som en båd, så det ved jeg ikke, om det kommer til at ske. Jeg ved heller ikke, hvad vanddybden er i området.
Nej.
Ubåden er ansvarsforsikret, og den skal fjernes. Det er så langt, kan jeg ikke tænke nu.
But the cops are immediately suspicious. They believe that Peter has scuttled the submarine on purpose, and while they remain unsure of what has happened to Kim Vel, he is also charged with negligent manslaughter. Peter initially claims that he has dropped Kim off on land, but within 24 hours he changes his explanation, and he admits that his passenger had apparently died in a horrific accident when a heavy metal hatch had hit her in the head. After panicking, Peter Madsen allegedly discarded her body in the sea out of fear that the authorities wouldn't believe his story. The day after his rescue, the Nautilus is raised to the surface, and forensics examinations are able to start. It doesn't take long for investigators to find clear traces of blood on board the vessel, which only serves to confirm the suspicion that something sinister has happened. And this is substantiated on August 21st, 10 days after Kim has been reported missing, when a cyclist finds her torso washed up on a beach in the southwest part of the island of Ama. Post-mortem examinations find 15 stab wounds on the body, mostly in the groin. Metal has been affixed to the remains, evidently to ensure that they wouldn't float. Peter still denies that he killed the woman, but he admits to mishandling her body, and meanwhile a judge grants a search warrant enabling the authorities to examine his computer. On his device, they find fetishist videos of torture and femicide, and while this doesn't prove his guilt, it immediately indicates a sexual motive. On October 6th, police divers find 2 plastic bags in the bay containing Kim Vel's head, legs, clothes, and a knife. And 6 days later, a saw is also found in the same area. Finally, on November 21st and 29, divers find Kim Vel's arms in the water. And with this discovery, they had managed to recover a complete body, which would prove important in the subsequent trial. On January 16, 2018, Peter Madsen is charged with murder, indecent handling of a corpse, and sexual assault. The prosecutors accuse him of having tortured Kim Vel prior to taking her life by either cutting her throat or strangling her. The trial begins on March 8, 2018, and on April 25th, Peter is convicted of all 3 charges and sentenced to life in prison. The verdict was subsequently appealed, but later upheld on September 26th in a higher court. Evidently after the incident, the cops had found videos on Peter Madsen's computer showing women being murdered, and several witnesses would testify that the man was known to have watched videos of decapitation and be interested in autoerotic asphyxiation. Forensics experts didn't find any traces of Peter's DNA on Kim Vel's body, but traces of semen were noticed on his underpants, which had been secured after the arrest. An examination performed on Kim's head after it was found a month after her murder found no signs of blunt force trauma, but it could also not determine the cause of death. This of course played a pivotal role in Peter Madsen's conviction, considering he had initially claimed Kim Vel died after being struck in the head by a hatch on the submarine. It forced him to change his story. Peter subsequently suggested that she may have died after poisonous exhaust gases had entered the submersible while he had been out on the deck, but he still admitted to dismembering her body. The only problem with this explanation was that the post-mortem examination of Kim Vel's torso had shown no signs of exhaust gases in her lungs. Locating all of the dismembered body parts in the vast sea that separates Denmark and Sweden had been a time-consuming and expensive process. It had taken teams of divers nearly half a year to recover them all. But in the end, these efforts proved decisive, as the forensics examinations of the remains were instrumental in discrediting Peter Madsen's excuses and ensuring his conviction. While the defense attorneys had not been surprised by the charges he eventually faced, Peter continued to claim that he was not guilty over the course of the trial, and to this day he has only legally admitted to dismembering Kim's body. He still denies having killed her. A lot of his time in prison so far has been spent at the Hastelvista facility in Copenhagen, a prison which also houses other notable Danish murderers such as Peter Lundin and Noam Konevsky, whose stories I've already covered on this channel. Hastelvista is a maximum security facility that additionally offers psychiatric treatment of its prisoners, which is why some of the worst killers in the country tend to end up there. Peter Madsen was admitted to the hospital in 2018 during his legal proceedings after being assaulted by an 18-year-old fellow inmate at the Storstrøm prison, where he had first been placed. So it was after this incident that he was moved to Hastelvista for his own protection. What strikes you about Peter is that he largely seems like a charming guy. Of course, it's not the first time a murderer has had a talent for making women like them. Ted Bundy is an example that comes to mind of this. And in Peter's case, he has even gone on to forge new relationships. Shortly after his conviction, it was revealed that he had engaged in a romantic connection with a female prison guard, and this woman actually ended up quitting her job because she didn't want to end the relationship. Of course, Peter's actual wife had left him shortly after the events that unfolded in the summer of 2017, but he ended up remarrying in 2019. This was with a woman called Jenny Kirpin, a Russian activist. Jenny defended her relationship with Peter in a post on social media in early 2020 by saying, and I quote, "My husband committed a horrible crime, and he is punished for that. However, knowing him for real gives me an exclusive right to say that I am lucky to be with the most beautiful, smart, talented, devoted, and empathetic person and man ever. My husband is one of 2 victims of this crime, and staying alive was a punishment itself for him." Yeah, I'll let that statement sink in for a moment. The biggest headlines that Peter created in the time after his conviction, however, was not due to his relationships. On October 20 in the year 2020, he actually escaped from prison. His freedom, however, was very short-lived. Peter likely didn't have much of a plan when he decided to flee. In this video pulled from the surveillance cameras, he's seen running across the courtyard only to realize he's going the wrong way, which forces him to double back. Peter had managed to fashion objects that resembled a gun and a bomb, enough that officers at the prison didn't want to take any chances. So even though they were ready to apprehend him immediately, he was able to talk his way out of the facility. This may make it sound like it's very easy to escape from prison in Denmark, and comparatively it may be, but guards here are not authorized to carry firearms. So when someone pretends to be carrying a bomb, it's deemed safer to let them walk and trail them at a safe distance instead. In fact, Peter was quickly apprehended again a short time later in a nearby residential area after he had been surrounded and bomb experts had determined his device was a decoy. On February 9, 2021, a court handed him a 21-month additional sentence for his attempted escape, and he was subsequently moved back to the more secure Storstrøm prison, where he had initially been jailed prior to his conviction. During his time behind bars, rumors say that Peter Madsen has evidently confessed to other murders. It's important to note that there's never been sufficient information to charge him in relation to other homicides, but supposedly a former fellow inmate has claimed that Peter has made admissions while in prison. Peter was indeed investigated in connection with another very infamous case in Denmark, the 2016 murder of Emilie Meng. Now, this is a case that I am absolutely going to explore in a future episode, so I don't want to talk too much about it today. But Peter Madsen apparently used to own a van, which possibly matched a vehicle seen on surveillance cameras at a train station around the time the 17-year-old girl had gone missing. But after it had been seized and examined, the van was found to not contain any incriminating forensics evidence. And in 2023, another person was arrested and convicted of the murder, which ruled out Peter's connection to this case. For some time, the cops considered if Peter Madsen could have been linked to the death of a Japanese woman called Kazuko Toyonaga in 1986, but eventually they decided to not pursue this theory either. Kazuko's remains were found in a very similar way, discarded in plastic sacks in the harbor, but there was simply too little information for the authorities to link Peter to this homicide, so this possibility was quickly abandoned. Often in murder cases, the cops will look at possible connections to other unsolved deaths, and they did so as well after Peter Madsen was convicted, as I just went over. But whether there's any truth to these claims of Peter confessing to more murders, only time will tell. Until more substantial information materializes, he will simply remain at the heart of a dark and horrifying tale, which since the summer of 2017 has been known in Denmark as the Submarine case.
The trial begins for the Danish inventor accused of murdering a Swedish reporter last year. Peter Madsen is accused of killing Kim Wall on a private submarine in August.
This story made worldwide headlines for a number of obvious reasons. It's not like you hear about a murder on a homemade submersible every day. But while it's easy to be fascinated by the many extraordinary elements of the story, the crime scene, the famous killer, the immense search for the remains which covered many square miles of seabed, it's important to not forget the tragedy at the heart of it. Kim Wall was a young woman who had a long life ahead of her. And while we will likely never know the full extent of what Peter Madsen did to her aboard the submarine, by all indications, she met a gruesome and horrifying demise at the hands of a man who deserves to spend the rest of his life in prison. This is it for today's episode. Make sure to subscribe to my channel if you haven't done so already. And if you appreciated this video, give it a like. I will be back in 2 weeks with another story. Thank you for watching.